First, just want to thank everyone that showed up today and gave some of their spare time to join the webinar today. Just a quick note here, if you have any questions, just please type them in the chat. We'll have some time at the end today to do a Q&A and answer some of those questions that you guys submit. Overall, goal for today is really to have kind of a big overview dialogue surrounding GPS wearables and the value that is derived from the data collected by them. We have a bunch of folks on today from all over, different backgrounds, from professional sports to grassroots to high school to college. So hoping that y'all are able to pull some good nuggets out of today's conversation. The agenda for today, agenda for today is to first kind of go over, again, high level, what are GPS wearables, what are the systems, and then the why behind them. And then Coach Rash, who I'll introduce here in a second, will talk a little bit more about how he uses GPS systems at Baylor University. And then we're going to go over also how GPS wearables can be used at high school levels and below for a little bit. And then again, at the end of here, we'll do a Q&A for about 15 minutes or so. So with that, I first introduce myself. My name is Ryan Miller. I am an AE for PlayerData, GPS wearables company. Prior to that, I was a defensive lineman at Baylor University. And then after that, I was also worked in the weight room as a graduate assistant while I was at grad school at Baylor. And really our keynote speaker here today is Coach Eric Rash. He is the director of applied performance at Baylor University. He got to Baylor in 2017, which is actually the same time I rolled up to Baylor my freshman year. Prior to which, Coach Rash was at the University of Iowa, where he assisted in a variety of sports. Coach Rash, thanks for being here today.
Awesome to be here, Ryan. I appreciate it.
Great. Yeah, so we'll just jump right into it. So Coach Rash, really first question here is regarding just like, what are GPS wearables? What are the system? Like, what is the system? How does it work? And why do we use them?
It's a great question. I think my approach to explaining this is keep it as high level as you can. There's a lot of technical things in the background that you go to work and not super relevant at this point in time. But in a nutshell, a GPS device is a device that is worn by an athlete or an individual, and it tracks their location, right? I think we're familiar with GPS and what it does. We have it in our phones. We have it in all kinds of different things, our watches, what have you. You get air tags to be able to track things. So essentially, that's what GPS wearables are. They're devices that connect with the satellites in space to triangulate a position on Earth. We can use them for a bunch of different use cases. In our situation, we're tracking athletes as they move around the field, as they move around the court, as they move around different space. So you can get a bunch of different information in terms of speed, position, distance covered, how many sprint efforts, how many acceleration efforts, deceleration efforts, different change of directions. And then based on, the technology and who's providing it, there may be a whole bunch of other sensors that are integrated into the wearable device to give you a lot more specific metrics. So, there's a lot of nuance there. So if we want to dig deeper, we can, but that's the gist of it.
Yeah, that's great. What type of sports utilize GPS wearables?
Yeah, another great question. The big sports are going to be your field sports that are outside, like soccer, rugby, lacrosse, football, American football. There's use cases where baseball athletes are wearing GPS trackers now. Pretty much any sport can wear it. There's different solutions based on, what manufacturer technology you're you're going with, but there are indoor solutions as well that use a different type of technology, and we can go into that if you're interested as well. But it pretty much runs the gamut. If there's a sport that moves in space, you can use GPS with it.
Awesome. Makes sense. And then do you know anything about how GPS got introduced to the United States originally, or basically the origin of utilizing GPS to track athletic data?
Yeah. So there's it depends on who you talk to that was around, back in the early 2010s. You're going to kind of get a different version of events, but there was a company out of Australia that was, well, several companies out of Australia that were using GPS for Australian rules football, rugby, things like that. And then it was a couple coaches from an American university went down there, met with the folks that were doing that, and they brought back the technology to their university program, and kind of the rest is history, so they say. And that was early 2010s. I want to say maybe even 2010, 2011 timeframe. And then it's grown from there. There's a bunch of different universities across different levels that are using the technology now, and into the high school levels and beyond. So
Awesome.
yeah.
And then as far as the actual value that's being provided by GPS wearables, could you give like maybe a very high level, like 3 bullets of like this are the biggest value adds that
Yeah.
GPS wearables provide?
So I think for us, the big value add is that we have an account of what the athlete's done, right? You're not guessing. You're not making approximations. You have objective information that's telling you what the athlete's been exposed to. It's another means for us to be able to audit our training and our practice planning, that what we set out to do, did we accomplish that goal? Then there's the accountability piece, there's the competition piece, and the longitudinal tracking. So, you have an idea of what athletes have done versus what you expected them to do, and then how has that changed over time. So you're able to make better decisions based on off that information, and hopefully that leads to an improved version of the athlete.
That's great. Um, Kind of switching gears a little bit, not a ton, but really want to ask you more about how you specifically are using GPS devices in your position at Baylor. Um, I would First question really revolves around how are you using them in season, right, for
Yeah.
the football team? And I know some of the people on the call today might not have a football background, but I think there is some application that still could be useful from this.
Yeah. So, I mean, like we kind of talked about already, but the use cases extend just beyond, a sport like football and what have you. I think general principles apply across the board. In season, what we're using it for is to be able to track the volumes of work athletes are doing over the course of a week, individual sessions, and then what is happening on game day. So what they're actually being exposed to when they're between the lines, and what's needed from them. And are we preparing them over the course of the week for that? So what we tend to look at is that, based off of historical information. We've had the luxury of having GPS at Baylor for almost 10 years now. So there's a treasure trove of information to reference as we project out moving forward. So to be able to know what groups of athletes have done, different positions, things like that, to be able to project and plan is huge. So within that, you have weekly allotments of what athletes have been exposed to previously, and then you can start to bucket that up day by day. So you have different percentages on different days of different metrics that you may be looking at. This idea of player load, or load in general, is just a somewhat general term to categorize volume of work an athlete's done. So you can have load from a bunch of different metrics, distance, effort, things like that. But you're just trying to divvy that up so athletes aren't exposed to the same thing every single day, right? So there's an undulation or an ebb and flow um, to that, whether it's, they're pushed one day and then it's slightly reduced the next, so on and so.
Right. That's awesome. And how impactful would you say is the data on the actual decision making for structuring practices leading up to the game to make sure guys are staying healthy and are primed and ready to go to compete?
Right. So I think for us, it's been somewhat of an evolution where, we're trying to get a sense of what the athletes are being exposed to and then feeding that information back to the coaches, not to necessarily say anything needs to change, but just to make them aware.
Mhm.
And then that's evolved over time, just providing more guardrails and guidelines. Again, but you leave it up to the coach to make the final decision. You try to provide them as much information as you can on what the athlete's done and what they're prepared for, so that they can make the best decisions, moving forward, answering questions to be able to, establish some ground rules on things so that you don't run into a situation where athletes are, to use a weight room concept, they're not maxing out every single day, right?
Right.
So that there is this undulation, so that athletes are primed and ready to peak on game day instead of on a Tuesday practice.
Right. And the actual data that you're reporting to coaches, what does that look like? What is the information that position coaches or Coach Aranda at Baylor is asking for out of the GPS units to kind of drive their decision making?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think that's one that has definitely changed over time. I think originally it was more so providing. I think we looked at some like 15 or so metrics, and then whittled that down to maybe 3 or 4. Metrics that we're interested in are obviously max velocity. That's the most um, obvious one that coaches understand. I think we look at acceleration values as well, and that's going to be dependent based on position, where you need athletes to be able to accelerate at a higher level. We look at distance covered, and high speed distance covered. So based on what speed threshold an athlete is capable of, they're going to accumulate distance within certain ranges. And we like to keep an eye on that. So again, it's a measure of intensity, so that athletes aren't being exposed to high intensity every single day, because eventually
Right.
over time, performance is going to erode, or it sets an athlete up to potentially become injured.
Right. And from this might be a tough question to answer, but just going off of my memory, right? Like whenever I was at Baylor, there was several times we'd be in a team meeting and they'd be flashing up top speeds during specifically kickoff, right?
Yeah,
So really my question surrounding that is from a position coach perspective, um, how valuable how valuable is the data in making actual strategic decisions for who's going to get a spot in terms
yeah,
of how much effort are they putting forth, their athletic capabilities, things like that. Obviously you kind of need the Jackson Joes to know the X's and O's and that sort of thing, but
right.
as a supplemental tool for decision making, like how do you think GPS wearables align with that?
Yeah, no, I mean that's a great question. I think for us, definitely coaches want to know what guys are capable of. So kickoff, your example is right on. Like that's a unit that you want speed. You want guys that can fly down the field and make plays. So coaches want to know how fast guys are, and guys that are not fast probably aren't going to make that specific unit. So providing them that information is something that they find value. And is that making the final decision? I can't say. I don't believe it is, but it definitely goes into the decision making process. We had the luxury at Baylor to be able to couple some of the video that we're getting from practice with the wearable, some of the wearable data that we've got as well. So we can see on certain plays what speeds, what accelerations guys hit, to know, is a particular wide receiver, for example, capable of running a specific route the way that the coaches need or want him to be able to run it. So we can dig deeper on some of that stuff and provide that information back to the coaches, which I mean, there's a ton of context around that for them, so they appreciate that. Um, yeah, so I mean that's how has been implemented in the past. I think some of the more nuanced stuff around the load tracking and some of the return to play things as well factor in. But
Right.
yeah,
Um, and kind of going off the speed tracking side of things. So just from my experience now, hopping around to a bunch of different schools, talking to coaches, there's a whole group of different methodologies that
yeah,
coaches are using in the off season to really track the progression of speed
yep,
and make sure guys are progressing the way they need, whether it's doing flying tens or
yep.
actually timing, hand timing, 10-yard splits, that sort of thing. So in your opinion, like where do you think GPS wearables fall over the course of an off season in terms of enabling coaches to be able to measure the actual athletic capabilities of things like top speed, acceleration, deceleration, that sort of stuff?
Yeah, I mean, it takes the guesswork out of it. I think um, it gives you that objective information, the ease of collecting the data and then getting it up to the platform to be able to do any type of analysis. When I say analysis, I mean it's simply making observations on what the data is saying to you from that particular session.
Right.
That you can get super in the weeds with that, but yeah, just at the highest level, just downloading the data and seeing what guys did for that day, and then being able to feed that information back to the athlete. Making it available for discussions with them. If you're trying to instill a certain standard or expectation, build your culture, you can that having that objective information is going to be huge.
Right.
Um,
How much are y'all relaying the actual GPS data back to players in order to hold them, I guess, accountable to a standard, as you said, or to their individual standard and a team standard, if at all?
right. Right. Yeah. I mean, super simple. Like a coach a long time ago, record, rank, and post is the easiest way to build buy-in and accountability for your athletes based on whatever the goals of that particular session were. So the information that's fed back to the athletes is going to be context dependent. So yesterday, for example, was our max velocity session, and I think we had, well, you and I were talking about it earlier. We had 40 plus guys hit new speed PRs. We had over 10, 11 guys hit close to 22 or over 22 miles an hour, which at this point in the summer, like you want your fast guys to still be fast and
Be
getting
running fast.
faster,
Yeah.
hopefully, as you're getting closer and closer to camp and the season coming here. So I think just something simple is just putting a list up, guys that ran the fastest, tacking that up to the board. They'll come by, they'll ask questions, and if you want to have conversations around it, I think that's the beauty of it as well. Like it creates that environment where guys are competing on all kinds of things and they're proud of the work that they're putting in. So that the next time you come back out, you get the same level of effort. So that's
Yeah.
been that's been successful, here recently and over my career in the long term. So
Right. That's great. Um, Two more questions really here, but how important would you say it is to be able to collect data early and often on guys in the interest of having something to compare it to? So, more specifically, having the information over the off season, which is probably where they're going to be hitting a lot of top speeds because they're not wearing pads, they're not tired, and then
right.
going into a season and being able to compare against that and make sure that they're at least sustaining or not falling short of that at a drastic rate.
Yeah, I think that's really really important, right? For us, our first and it's going to be dependent on who's running the training, strength coaches, how their training is being planned and what the exercise prescription is and things like that. And then also, based on coaching staff, what type of scheme are they running? What are the expectations that the athletes are gonna be needing to do on game day?
Hmm.
Um, it's huge, right? To be able to have an idea of what athletes have been exposed to, and then how to make decisions off that moving forward. So for us, when I first got here, one of the first things with it was just to be able to collect a season's worth of information on the athletes, right? From practice,
Right.
from games, not necessarily acting, taking a ton of action off that information. I mean, after a few weeks or months, like you have an idea of roughly where athletes are going to sit, so you can notice massive outliers. But that first year is really just collecting the information so that you can compare it moving forward and make better decisions.
Right.
Otherwise, you can make a rash decision or a reaction that's uh, not really warranted because the numbers don't have a ton of context. So, as you build that up moving forward, then you can make better decisions.
Sure. Final question for you on this topic. It's a little different from the actual performance side of things, but in terms of outside people coming in, so specifically like NFL scouts
Right.
coming in and asking you about players, because even when I was there as a GA, like I'd be at practice and I'd have some NFL guy ask me about a guy, and I'm just a student assistant, which is wild to think about. So they're trying to get as much information on
Yeah.
guys as possible. But when scouts come in there, is it common that you see they're asking for GPS numbers?
Yeah. So all that information gets provided to our strength coach. And when he's having those individual meetings with scouts or things like that, yeah, that information is at hand to be able to relay to them. I think there's definitely an interest because this stuff being tracked at the pro level too. So to have an idea of, where the professional guys are at within certain positions and then where guys coming out of college are at, you can make better comparisons that way. So I think it's definitely information that the NFL scouts are interested in. Um, yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Um, all right, so we're gonna switch gears here a little bit. Um, really going to focus more on here for this next bit about how coaches can leverage GPS systems at the high school level and below.
Yeah.
So, kind of a hypothetical first one here, Coach. Um, how do you think at a high school level, if a team were to start using GPS today, what are your initial thoughts on the immediate impact you would see? Let's say going into fall camp this year and this season.
So I think the immediate impact is going to be on the competition side of things, right? And being able to um, offer that type of information. If we're talking about max speed, just for a simple example, right? To be able
Mm-hmm.
to offer that information back to guys, the guys that are fast are going to be fast, right? They're going to display that speed and some capacity, and the guys that aren't. So to be able to have that information, match that up with what maybe you're subjectively seeing already, is going to be an immediate impact.
Right.
I think also too, just even after a week of practice or training with that, you're going to have some information that you can compare to the week after that. Not that you're necessarily going to make a bunch of decisions off that, as we kind of talked about already, right? You want that
Right.
the data to accumulate, but you can see a difference in weekly structure, daily structure, kind of what are the high days, what are the lower days, or is every day the same? So you'll be able to tell that fairly quickly, which could be insightful for a lot of coaches and maybe it doesn't line up with what their intentions are, which I think is valuable information to have as well. If you've got a session where you're expecting guys to be able to run fast, and we'll say, at the college level, that 20-mile-an-hour threshold is what everybody points to.
Hmm.
There are a fair amount of high school kids that can run that fast, but the majority of them probably, somewhere around that 17 to 19
Right.
mile an hour range. So, and again, the more data you collect, you'll be having a better idea of, what kind of the different speed groups are within your particular roster. But to be able to see that information could be eye opening, and you can see it pretty quickly.
Right. That's great. Um, and in your opinion too, in terms of the value that GPS wearables provide from I'm just taking some like athlete agency here of
Sure.
keeping kids healthy and safe
Yeah.
during fall camp and preventing things like heat exhaustion, for example, because like I know growing up in Texas, playing football in Texas in high school, like that's still a common problem. And how do you think having something like a GPS system and leveraging the workload components could play a factor within that?
Yeah. Initially, could potentially be somewhat difficult. I think over time, it'd be easier because you'd have, a body of data to compare against. I think definitely from a distance and total distance standpoint, um, you'd be able to see, what the athletes have been exposed to, and then being able to come back the next day and, do less if that were the
Right.
issue, right? As far as the heat exposure piece, really, I mean, hard to say because it's a GPS unit, but
Yeah.
the volume of work and the intensity of the work is something you're definitely going to be able to quantify.
Right.
So, coming from a hard day, or say a hard day, or where, your intensity metrics, what you're looking at as measures of intensity, if those numbers are high, you come back the next day, you don't want them as high, right?
Right.
Things like that. Super simple example, maybe, but that's how I would look at it.
Yeah. It's just like a continuous process of monitoring it and making sure that you're not deviating super strong in one direction or the other, right? To try and keep kids healthy there. But sort of in the same line of thinking here with workload, um, specifically at the high school level, right? Like, you know, less and less as you go up through the ranks of football organizations, there seems to be, there is usually a pretty big talent disparity from your
Mm,
best guy on your team to your worst guy on your team, or I don't want to say worst, but I guess least talented person on your team,
yeah,
making your impact players in high school that much more impactful
yeah,
in terms of your ability to literally win or lose games. Um, like there's a quote I think of with Buddy Morris, who's the head strength coach of the Cardinals, and he talks about how I kind of mentioned it earlier, but like if you don't have the dudes on your team initially, like you're not going to win football games. Like that's your most important and valuable asset as a
yeah,
coach is your players. So
yeah.
in terms of keeping those guys healthy and preventing injuries, within high school teams, like where do you see GPS wearables playing a part in that?
Yeah, I think it can definitely play a part, right? We talk about exposures and what athletes have been prepared for. So taking data from training sessions, presumably you're wearing the GPS unit anytime you're outside or anytime, they're in a situation where they're going to be exposed to a bout of work. You want to be able to capture that. So understanding what they've been exposed to and then what you will then expose them to in terms of, let's say, practice, right? So
Mm-hmm.
if guys are going to run fast or be expected to run fast in practice, have you run fast in training? And when was the last time the guys actually ran fast or the athletes actually ran fast? And what is that gap? If in training you ran fast your first training session, and then a month later they haven't run anywhere close to those speeds, and they're having a practice session, and all of a sudden they're exposed to that, that's when injuries are going to occur potentially, right? So
Right.
anytime the capacity has been exceeded, you're at risk for injury, right? So speed, intensity are the biggest ones to keep in mind there.
Yeah.
Especially in a sport like football, like power speed sport. You want to be fast, you want to be powerful. So you got to be exposed to that. Before, certainly before game day, but in practicing.
Right. I think in the interest of kind of indulging that topic a little further, because I think it is an interesting one, and maybe to get a little more granular with it, like what is the methodology behind how you would actually structure an off-season workout to prep for that top speed and intensity during the season, or like how do you approach it?
Yeah, I think if you're able to work backwards from competition, so maybe that's kind of a cheating way to look at it. So we'll have game day information and what guys have been exposed to on average across the course of a season, what those values look like. So then we're able to reverse engineer that throughout our off season. So you can go back, on a percentage based approach. You can take all the way back to really low level at the beginning of the off season and slowly
Mm-hmm.
progress your way up, right? With different ebbs and flows across that as well. So by the time you get to practice or competition, like you've ensured that the athletes have been exposed to that. They've worked up to those certain percentages, so that when they're exposed during competition, they're not at as high a risk to become injured.
Right. Right. No, that's great. Um, Kind of moving along here too. So we've discussed briefly about the importance of enhancing team culture and enforcing
Yeah.
standards and team competition. Um, so at the high school level, like how do you see, or where could you see utilizing GPS to do just that? Whether it's as a team, setting standards at the team level, position level, individual level. One thing I think about too, for driving team culture, and it's kind of a different dynamic in high school, is you have parents involved.
Yeah.
So also the value that you could get as a coach during a parent meeting, and maybe it's not something you're capable of answering, but just kind of me talking about it,
Yeah.
um, of being able to objectively show them how hard your kid is working or is not working, and why they might not be getting the playing time they're wanting based off of their ability or inability to reach or match or exceed those standards.
Yeah, I think the way I like to look at the information we're getting from the GPS is really you have your volume and you have intensity. So what athletes are being exposed to overall, and then how, if you can look at it as an effort thing, but how much of an intensity are they accumulating out of the total volume? So in
Mm-hmm.
terms of even meeting with the athlete, obviously I'm not interacting with parents in my position here, but
Right.
um, interacting with athletes or parents, even, you have what position groups are typically being exposed to and accumulating, and you can do, different averages and percentiles if you wanted to. So you could develop a ranking system more or less, and
Right.
then you could display where that particular athlete falls within that ranking system or rank
Right.
within their position, and then be able to dive deeper into either the volume or intensity side of things to find out why. So is it, from a developmental standpoint, do they just not have the capacity to express um, different things at a high level, versus maybe some of their other teammates. So are there different ways from a training side of things that we can bring that up? Or is it truly an effort thing where, they've demonstrated they do have the capacity, they just for whatever reason it's not coming along at the clip as some of the other athletes, right? And that's where, being able to see what different things have been accumulated across different position groups could be key.
Right.
So that's some of the things that we've done here, right? You build out normative values or different percentiles for each position group because they are so different, and to see where athletes fall within that, and then being able to feed that information back to both the coaches and the athletes themselves.
Right. And speaking like myself on behalf of being an athlete and being within on a sports team, right? The pressure, or not pressure, but like the desire to want to be first,
Yeah,
and more importantly, not be last, right? There's
yeah,
nothing worse than being last. That's the reason why there's top maxes of like bench press, squat in the weight room, right? Or
yeah,
that's why everyone's always competing to see who has the fastest 40. It's because
yep,
at a foundational level, across all sports, there's a desire to compete,
yeah,
and being able to tap into that as a coach and really use that to your advantage, I think is extremely valuable. Um,
yep,
and that also includes, like, you know, the worst thing ever is being injured and having to sit out and watch guys too. So,
yeah.
but
Well, I
uh,
think, and that's something we didn't really touch on, but I think on the return to play side of things, like
yeah,
massive use for GPS there, right? For those of you that work closely with medical people at your specific schools, that's information athletic trainers would want to know, or you'd at least be able to make available to them. It's like, what the baseline information or the pre-injury information is, and then what the athlete it needs to work back up to. Speed is the obvious one, especially coming off a hamstring injury. You have data on what they were before they got injured, and then during the rehab process, be able to work off that number, prescribe different percentage of efforts and things like that, and then be able to track that as they're reintroduced into the team setting, so that they're not just like thrown to the wolves, the minute that they're cleared. Right? There's a thought through process to return them to their sport.
yeah, definitely, most definitely. Um, Kind of rolling into our last few topics here, we're going to talk about the importance of increasing your visibility and transparency amongst your organization. And then we'll finish up with talking about the impact on recruiting. But to kind of come back here to the visibility piece, right? So specifically at in high schools, there's some teams I've been around where they'll have 350 kids
Yeah,
within an organization,
yeah,
and you're talking about, a coach to player ratio of like 20 to 30 at sometimes. And
yeah,
it's literally, it's extremely difficult to have a good understanding or a good grasp of the talent you have at your disposal. So, within that, I would ask, do you ever find yourself kind of uncovering a hidden gem, if you would, through having a GPS wearable on someone, where you're like, oh wow, this guy is like actually really fast, but he doesn't look like it, or you're able to kind of, again, like uncover and then be able to use the talent and the guys you have on your team better at your disposal.
yeah. It's funny. We just had this conversation with our assistant yesterday. We've got a walk on that came just before spring ball started in March,
Mm-hmm.
and he's a wide receiver, and he's one of our fastest uh, wide receivers of that position. And we do some different things in terms of like specific routes and being able to capture different speeds within specific routes and things like that. And the routes that this guy's gonna be needing to run, like he's pretty fast at doing that. And that's somebody that just came with us, not recruited out of high school or big name athlete or anything like that. Just kind of shows up the week before spring ball starts, and
Yeah.
we'll see how it continues to develop. But yeah, things like that, you uncover it, because we wouldn't have known otherwise. Um, yeah, yeah. So that's a silly example, but a recent
And it's
one.
even like in my eyes too, at the college level, like you've got a lot of support on
Yeah,
every end, from position coaches to obviously the sports science teams to strength staff, to have that visibility on your guys. So the
yeah,
fact that there's even a situation there where you're like, oh, like you're leaning, not necessarily leaning, I don't know if that's a fair word, but you're using GPS technology to uncover that information.
yeah,
So if you pump that up at a scale at a high school level, some of these high schools, or even like, let's talk about like club soccer teams where
hmm,
there's literally maybe 1,000 kids there,
hmm,
right? Like how valuable it is to you to then, as a coach or a director, make decisions on who goes on what team and have a
yeah,
supplemental tool there,
yeah,
to be able to make those decisions. But
yeah,
we're kind of coming up towards the end here, and I want to make sure we can answer questions. And I really want to talk about this next topic, which
yeah,
is kind of a hot topic within every sport right now, is recruiting, right? With NIL and everything going around, the importance of being able to market yourself as an athlete and make yourself stand out, is becoming more and more valuable, right? Um, so what I would ask is, like, how could you see a GPS system impacting an athlete's, I guess, recruitability out
mm,
of high school, in terms of offering another supplemental piece of information to give to college coaches, that to help
yeah.
them stand out?
Yeah, I mean, I think really interesting times in the NIL side of things, and we'll see how wearable data in general plays a role in that. I think um, from an exposure side of things, and you're seeing it already, the amount of the amount of DMs and things like that the kids will send out to anybody associated with any program just because they want eyeballs on them. I
Right.
think the GPS information as it continues to grow at the high school level is going to definitely play a role in that, right? So where you're able to, because huddle video is something all that athletes have now, it seems like, and then to be able to couple that with the different GPS information, I mean, you can pinpoint an exact play where they ran a certain speed, and then skill positions, different position coaches, like that's going to at least um, lead them to take a look at a kid. So I think it's definitely going to have an impact. To the extent, hard to say. It's still early, but I
Mm-hmm.
think it's definitely going to play a role, and it'll probably even be a thing at the college level too.
Right. And I think about, you hit on it a little bit, but the thing that's tough with high school and recruiting and film in general, especially once you start getting into some of the smaller divisions, is the talent that they're playing against, right? So to your point,
Yeah,
if you're able to have that supplemental information to go alongside someone's film, it's like you
yeah,
don't have to question anymore. It's like, is he actually fast, or is he just playing against slow guys? Right?
sure,
Where it's like,
sure,
well, this guy at the 6A school over here is running the 21 miles per hour. This guy is also running 21 miles per hour, but he's playing 2A football.
right,
So those kids can have a better chance of
yeah,
having more visibility of what they're actually doing on the fields, and it
yeah,
kind of, in a way, legitimizes the performance that they're putting on, I think.
yeah. No, I agree with you 100%. I think um, you know kids it's changing now, but like the high school camps in the summer and getting exposure through that, where you're running just a traditional 40,
Yeah.
and you have a fast time there. That's awesome. We definitely want to see that, but that's not football. So to be able to show that you're fast in the context of the sport, is a whole nother thing, right? So there's straight ahead fast, or track fast, and then there's football fast.
Right.
So
Definitely. And
yeah,
I think that's something to kind of wrap up the final piece here, is that the GPS wearables really can paint like a full picture more so of who an athlete is, right? Because like to your point, like the 40-yard dash from a data perspective is a single data point. And it's only happening in one moment in time, and it's not during a football game.
right.
Versus a GPS system can be worn during a football game. So you're not only looking at what that athlete's top speed is, but also the accessibility of that speed,
Yeah,
which you kind of start to begin to talk about what type of player someone is, like how much, and that's kind of the question of, how much effort, like, do you want the 4-7 Mike linebacker, but you're getting the 4-7 the majority of the snaps, or do you want the 4-6 guy, but you're only getting it 1 or 2 snaps a game?
hmm
So being able to kind of paint the picture and fill in the gaps for some of these kids on what makes them special or what makes them good, because there's been plenty of guys I've played with that, like Terrell Bernard comes to mind, like complete beast, right?
hmm
Plays for the Buffalo Bills, but I mean, he wasn't athletically doing anything unbelievable. He was just a pro, super smart, knew the game, and he was giving the most amount of effort every single snap.
right. Yeah, well said.
Yeah. Cool. So with that, we're at 10:50. So we'll answer. It looks like we really only have one question here in the chat, but it's a pretty good one, and I actually don't know the answer to it, Rash. So I'm curious if you might know the answer to this. But Christopher Watts asks, "Is there a national ranking database to draw comparisons outside the athletes on my team?" So is there a way, if you were to have GPS units, to then go and look at and basically do a comp analysis
Right.
across maybe other teams or other age groups, et cetera?
So I wish there were. Unfortunately, I think the privacy side of things, different GPS manufacturers, that information is not something they make publicly available.
Yeah,
I think there are some different companies that are trying to do some things in that space, but yeah, it's going to be tough just with different manufacturers and different systems in place and just different privacy policies, that information isn't really going to be shared publicly. Who knows with NIL and how the college landscape is changing? Maybe we get to a point where, like in the professional leagues, that information is readily available to different member institutions and things like that. For
yeah,
right now, that's not something that we've got access to. It would be awesome, because then we'd be able to know where we stack for sure. It'd help in recruiting. It'd help transfer portal decisions, all kinds of stuff. So
yeah. No, I think that's a great answer, and I think, especially if you're an athlete, being able to, again, back to the recruiting piece, project that data. Maybe there could be a platform to make that information more readily available, where something like that could exist. For people in attendance, I just, if you have any questions you've been holding on to, like right now is a good time to ask them. But we'll just keep rolling through these. Next question is, how much space do you need to really take advantage of GPS? Like, what is the minimum space needed?
um, I don't know if there is a minimum. So I kind of touched on it earlier, like based on what system. is being used, there are options to even have tracking indoors, right? So, we've had situations with our basketball and our volleyball teams to be able to have a player tracking solution implemented within them. So I think there are like the very, I'll say almost none of these GPS units only do GPS.
Right.
There's other sensors embedded, and this, I don't want to get too technical, but there's other sensors collecting other information alongside GPS information. So it makes them usable inside as well as out. Because when you're inside, you don't have access to the sky, so you don't have access to the GPS.
Right.
So,
That's great. Next question here is asking about what percentage thresholds do you look for an athlete to hit during the practice week in comparison to like their top game demands?
sure. I think in terms of, let's say, max speed, the 90% threshold is something that's pretty widely used. So you want to try to make sure your athlete, especially your athletes that need to be fast, right? That's their livelihood. They need to be hitting that higher end threshold at least once per week, both from the performance side of things and then also the injury mitigation side of things too.
Right. Okay. So for right now, that's all the questions we have. I'll give it one more minute if anyone wants to throw any last minute questions. Otherwise, we'll wrap this up. Because we have a hard cutoff here at 11. Okay.
Cool.
Oh, here we go. Okay, so this says for backups at a position that don't hit the overall demands of a starter at their position, how close to game day do you want to alter their work to hit those thresholds? Okay, that's a good question. So for someone who's not necessarily playing in the game, how is there a way, or I actually am curious what the answer is to this too. Is there a way that you're altering or their thresholds are altered during the week to be able to get closer to like a max velocity?
I want to make sure I understand the question.
Yeah, I guess you can see it too, right?
Yeah. Um, I think it's gonna be dependent on the position that athlete is playing.
Mm-hmm.
Because yeah, if you have a guy that's not getting the reps in practice, and let's just keep it simple, like the velocity side of things, they're not getting the exposures to run that 90%, right? So what can you do outside of maybe the context of practice to make sure that they do hit that? And one that's done in a lot of different places is they'll have, either during a specific segment of practice, like a special teams period, to touch on the example that you hit earlier, Ryan,
Mm-hmm.
or just, a top up segment at the end of practice, even, right? I've heard of schools doing that where guys will just take the pads off, get your GPS unit on, and then they'll just run a full out sprint effort to hit that number.
Which that's the worst in my experience.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
hey, you just did a full practice.
Yeah.
Buckle your chin strap. Go do a full
So,
sprint.
yep. Yep. Not something you're probably doing with your starters, but
Right.
athletes that haven't been exposed to that, that's one way to manufacture that exposure for sure. I hope that answered the question.
No, I think that was good. I think that was a good answer. Um, I think we'll just call it there, Coach.
Perfect.
If you have any last minute things you want to say or mention that you thought of, feel free to do it. Otherwise, really want to thank everyone for joining the call today. Coach, obviously great talking to you and getting
Yeah.
to catch up back up with you, you know. So
Yeah. I enjoyed it, Ryan. I appreciate the opportunity, and I mean, my contact information can be made available. And if anybody's got any questions or want to have a follow-up conversation, happy to do it. Open book. So yeah, no, I appreciate it. Thank you.
yeah, awesome. Thanks everyone again.